So 12 months ago, November 2018, I was living in the Bay Area. We'd just come out of a pretty difficult time. There had been fires that year as well. In fact, my kids had spent months indoors, weeks indoors, unable to go outside. Fortunately, that had all cleared, and the clocks must have changed, because I remember driving home late one evening with my son Rowan. I think he was 11 at the time. He was kind of zoning out after a hard day at school and a long day on the soccer field. And we're driving along the freeway in stop-go traffic. Those of you who live in a city would probably recognize that. And the cars are all around us, and the clouds are above us, and I think there was light drizzle coming down that evening. As you can imagine, the clouds were kind of glowing. We're kind of zoning out, and Rowan asked a question that really changed the course of my life. So as Ken said and as Jess said, my name's Ruskin Hartley, and I am so excited to be here with all of you today. I kind of pinched myself in the morning and think, do I get to do this? Do I get to work with this incredible group of advocates and passionate individuals from around the world about this issue of light pollution? I am humbled by all of the work that I have heard that you're doing. And I am also convinced that in the coming years, the future of this movement is going to be bright. In all the right ways, I might add. I'm convinced that we're going to take this to scale. So 12 months ago, I hadn't really heard about IDA, and I hadn't really thought about light pollution, which is kind of embarrassing because I've been in the environmental field for 30 years and I've led conservation organizations for 20 years. Light pollution had come up and we're like, oh, that's interesting. Let's move on to the more important topic, like trees being cut down and plastic being put in the ocean and poor people around the world. Let's move on to those issues. But what I have come to learn in the last 12 months and the last 9 months of really joining the staff is that light pollution is actually one of the most pervasive and least understood, yet most readily solvable forms of pollution that there is out there. I wondered as well whether I was the outlier. So I called a former colleague I'd worked with, a guy called Steve McCormick. Some of you might recognize the name Steve McCormick. He ran the Nature Conservancy in California. He, in fact, ran the Nature Conservancy internationally, one of the largest conservation groups in the world. He then went to the Gordon Betty Moore Foundation, involved in conservation funding, environmental funding, and actually healthcare funding. And I asked him, hey, Steve, have you ever thought about light pollution? He said, no, not really. So I guess I'm saying I'm in good company. But it's also part of the challenge, right? If one of the conservation leaders in this field hasn't really thought about light pollution. So I wondered, are we alone? I promise I'm going to share 2 graphs, and you don't really need to look at the numbers, don't need to look at the scales. So this is, I just looked at Google, and I think this is just a rank of where various terms appear in books. So the air pollution and water pollution, you can kind of see there in the middle up here. That's the 1960s. That led to the passage of the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act and all that good stuff. Catastrophic rise for climate change, so maybe there's some hope for the planet after all. Light pollution's that little green bar at the bottom. You know, it's bumping along. It's made some progress, right? We're feeling good about that, right? But then I thought, well, we're not really competing against those, right? What are we competing against? We're competing against apathy. So I thought, well, what? Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. That's what people are thinking about all the time, right? So climate change, yeah, it's there. It's kind of holding its own, maybe. Light pollution, you can't even see the line. So really, I just want the encouragement here. We're all here because we understand this issue. We're passionate about this issue. We understand this issue. But most of the world, whether they're thinking about sex, drugs, and rock and roll or putting food on the table, they're not thinking about most of these conservation issues that we're involved in. So how are we doing globally? Does anyone know what is 80%? 80% is an estimate of the number of people around the world who live under a polluted sky. In fact, the vast majority of people in North America and Europe can't actually see the Milky Way from their home. What is 1%? 1% is the number of people who know they're missing something. That's pretty scary. That's not a good number. What's 2%? Yeah, 2% is the rate of increase of light pollution globally. That's the one we have to be worried about. That's the one that's going to take us down in the air. Basically, light tracks economic growth, population growth, and consumption. We've been consuming more and more light voraciously. And as light gets cheaper, we can consume more and more of it. Unless we bend the curve, unless we bend that 2% curve, I think we were talking yesterday, there was a gentleman from France who came in, been at the Mayo conference, and shared that, oh, thank you, Sujay, had shared that, yeah, we're winning little battles, but overall, we're currently losing the war. We need to tackle that one. Fortunately, evidence that the problem is growing. I think if those of you, was anyone, and those of you who were involved probably 30 years ago, my guess is most of you were astronomers or amateur astronomers. And I think now one of the things we've learned through this movement is we're a much broader, more diverse movement. And one of the things we learned from nature is actually diversity brings strength. And I think that our movement is evidence of that. There's a growing body of evidence, as you all know, and you'll hear and talk about over the next few days, that light pollution impacts plants, it impacts animals, it impacts human health. And through just wasted energy, it contributes to climate change. Light pollution is the ultimate symbol of a wasteful society in many ways. It's becoming increasingly clear that light pollution is just one additional stressor to an already stressed environment. And as Jess shared, it's one we can solve. We've got the technology. We know how to do this. And I've worked previously in ocean issues. We have no idea how to clean up the plastic in the ocean. But as Jess said, turn off the light, shield that light, get the right lumens out there, problem solved. Celebrate it, move on to the next one. So we know how to do this. This is not going to be persistent for hundreds of years if we get it right. So one of the reasons I'm hopeful and optimistic, again, is the work that all you are doing and that's going on throughout our global community. So I wanted to just share a few of those as a kind of a bridge to the strategic priorities and just say, like, the strategic priorities are a direct reflection of the work that all of you have been doing. So first, our IDSP program, International Dark Sky Places program, has had an incredible year. There are now 131 and counting international dark sky places around the world in, wrong order, 20 countries. The latest one was just announced in Australia yesterday. Where's Marnie? Congratulations to everyone down under for getting their third dark sky place. The River Murray Reserve, 3,250 square kilometers. Australia's a big place. My guess is there are probably not many lights in that reserve, but it's incredible to lock that place down. So thank you, Marnie, and everyone down there for helping lead that charge. The number I want to call out, 25 dark sky places have been established this year. So a shout out to Adam and his team, and Mike. Where are you, Mike? You guys have been busy. What I find particularly exciting about the Dark Sky Places program is what it's starting to spur. And this is clearly not a picture of people looking at the moon. This is the Shenandoah Night Sky workshop that was put on by the Natural Sounds and Nightscape Division under the leadership of Karen Trevino in partnership with people at the McDonnell Observatory. And they brought together people, park rangers, maintenance workers, interpreters from across the country, from Alaska, from a park in Alaska, there's a maintenance worker, all the way down to cultural specialists from South Carolina working on a battlefield. So I think what we're seeing certainly in national parks is tackling light pollution and having responsible light is becoming just the way to do business. It's no longer just the domain of those incredible dark parks in Utah, and that's really exciting. I just wanted to call out Jeremy White and Ashley Pipkin and Frank Torino, who I think are with us, and they're really that core team that helps provide the support to all of the people in the field offices, along with people like Randy Stanley and others. So look them out. They're a great group to connect with. So one exciting thing, Karen's team is currently working to develop sustainable lighting standards for parks. Currently in the US, these do not exist. If you're a park, if you're a state park system looking for lighting standards, you don't have anywhere to go to. You're just falling back on the ones for roadways and cities and communities. So the vision is like, let's put that in place. Let's develop that. We'll be part of that. And my guess, if that's put in place, then the rest of the world will start to look to that for guidance. But I am particularly excited about our work to move away from protecting dark places. After all, dark places aren't causing the problem. The problem is causing from the lit environment, from the cities and communities where we live. And I admit this doesn't look particularly urban, but this is actually a picture of our first urban night sky place, the Val de Oro National Wildlife Refuge, which was accredited, I think, just last month, just outside Albuquerque. What's noteworthy about this is that there's actually no sky quality requirement to become a night sky place like this. But there is a requirement to promote the use of responsible nights and promote the interpretation of the natural environment at night. Particularly important for, I think these are sandhill cranes. If you've ever been out and watched those things take off or land at dusk, it's absolutely magical. Well, imagine if that field is blazing with lights. I imagine they're in all sorts of trouble. That work, in combination with the launch of our outdoor sports lighting program last year, and also some guidance around electronic messaging centers, those billboards, lit billboards that we see on those are sort of the work that IDA has been doing over the last year to say, look, we need to get out ahead of the trend in those new lit environments. It's not enough to say you can't have those, but we need to come up with ways to deal with them responsibly. So just a shout out to Chad Moore-Brad and Chris Monrad and others on the technical committee to really identifying that need, to identifying good lighting standards for those areas that are of problem. So thank you. The other thing that's really exciting, I feel like, again, joining at this time, the night sky is trending. Astro Tourism is trending. You can barely pick up a magazine these days without seeing an advert where someone's trying to sell something by showing how good it looks under the stars and under the Milky Way. I was recently down in New Zealand with funding actually from the US Embassy, brought us down there as part of an exchange program, Adam and I. It was really interesting for us to be down there and come after a long journey, and Al, where's Al? Al was down there as well, and Marnie and Annie. To come down after a very long journey and arrive in Tekapo, which is at the heart of the Arakai-Mackenzie International Dark Sky Reserve, the first in New Zealand, and realize this community has embraced this in an incredible way. Almost every single billboard and sign you see in town, every single advert is an experience at night. Astro Tourism tours, hot tubbing under the stars. They've just built, I know, a $30 million new dark sky project visitor center. Dark sky protection is good for business down there. These are rural communities figuring out they better work with what they've got, which is the sky. And these entrepreneurial businessmen and women in New Zealand are figuring it out. And people are starting to take notice. And a large part of that is due to new technology and the really great work of some great nightscapers, astrophotographers, and we have some with us today. Jeremy Evans, Royce Blair, John Ashley, and our very own Betty Meyer Foote are doing incredible work to show the beauty of the night sky. And you can even start doing that on your phone. So shout out to our astrophotographer community as well. Thank you. The last good news story I wanted to share is right here in Tucson. So how are we going to bend that curve? We're only going to bend that curve if we can start to demonstrate that we can actually reduce the amount of lumens we're putting into the environment and still maintain a safe, comfortable city. So those of you who flew into Tucson at night, you probably noticed that the airport's pretty well lit. Chris Monrad had a lot to do with that. We're also really excited about the work that's going on underway at the moment in the city of Tucson to replace its streetlights. It seems like almost every single time you talk about streetlight replacements, it ends with a bad news story. I think this story is somewhat, even in Tucson, is still in process, if I understand from Chris. But I mean, some of the early news is good. I mean, they replaced, I can't remember, Chris would say, but thousands of fixtures. And they did it very intentionally. So they reduced the overall lumens that were put out by 63%. They reduced blue light, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of discussion about blue light, by 34% over the legacy system. And for the city, they save $2.1 million each year in the operating costs. And city fathers, that's mothers. To say one of the things that triggered this was a letter I actually received from one of our members, Michael Moe. He lives in Rancho Santa Fe in California. I wanted to share a few of his words. He said, "I applaud the success of the IDA in creating dark sky islands in the sea of global light pollution. These islands are a treasure well worth preserving." But he goes on, "What concerns me more is the sea of pollution. As you know, light pollution is increasing at 2% a year, so he knows his stuff. And he offers a challenge, I think one that all of us in this room should pledge to seeing through and accepting. This trend of increasing pollution must begin to change." He goes on to present it as a David and Goliath proposition. We're not Goliath, we're David. So we have to rely on our skill and accuracy to take down the strength of Goliath in this case. And he notes, "No, we hunger for a demonstration of progress that will eventually manifest in regions where most of the populations live. We must start to reduce this 2% slope." In closing, he says, "I hope that someday, some dark night, I would again be able to make out Sagittarius in my summer sky." So that's what's driving him on. Your personal motivation may be different, but that's what's driving him on this journey. So again, how are we going to bend this arc of light pollution? We've identified 4 strategic priorities. First is celebrating the night. We want people to understand the beauty of the night, from its star-filled skies to the nocturnal animals and the wildlife that's around, but also recognize that there's a crisis. There's a light pollution crisis here that we need to address. People like me should know about light pollution, right? I worked in I should know about it, so heaven help. We need to continue to protect dark places. We need to identify and protect exemplary, intrinsically dark places through our certification program. Now, in a decade, what would it take to have identified and protected the most superlative dark sky places on the planet in every continent? But that's not enough. And the new areas, I am firmly convinced, is where our future lies, is lighting where we live and work. We need to work to engage cities and communities in reducing light pollution through responsible lighting policy and practice. If we don't do that, we can protect all those dark sky places. Light pollution knows no bounds. It's coming at you, hundreds of miles. Talk to John, it will come and get you on those days. And this is particularly important. I was at a conference with Jeff up in Utah. By 2040, the UN projects that 68% of the world's population is going to live in cities. So it's both an opportunity and a challenge there. And interestingly, that growth is coming through sprawl. It's not coming through increasing density, it's coming through sprawl, and that's bringing the light pollution. This is where IDA got started with the designation of Flagstaff, and it's somewhere that we need to continue to double our investments in this area. So within a decade, we want to see hundreds of cities, communities, and in fact nations adopt really smart policies and practices. But even this alone, these are 3 great building blocks, but ultimately where we need to get to something we're calling skyshed restoration. We need to demonstrate that we can implement coordinated, intentional, and scalable actions to slow, halt, and reverse the increasing rate of light pollution. Basically, we need to bring these things together to get to here. We need people to understand the problem. We need to understand the value of those dark places, to check the right boxes on their ballots when they're asked, to make those changes in their life so that we can demonstrate that. Within a decade, we need to demonstrate, not just in small communities, no disrespect to places like Moab in Utah, couple thousand lights, a Herculean effort for Adam and Betty Meyer to do the lighting inventory here, but we need to demonstrate in cities of 100,000 that we can do this. I was talking to Kathy and Bill Flanagan yesterday from Oregon, and they're starting to think about this as well. The city of Bend, I get my numbers right, Kathy, is about 90,000. It's projected to grow to 110,000. It might be a great case study. It's pretty isolated there. Can they grow and manage their light pollution? And how can we help to make sure? Now, if we can demonstrate we can do it, then there's no excuses. Just do it. You save money. People are happy. People are healthy. The wildlife's good. The whales haven't fallen off the bus. That's what we need to demonstrate. And that's the journey that we're on over the coming years. So I am really excited to travel along this path with you. I'm sure there will be bumps and roadblocks along the way, but as Jess again shared, we're in it for the long haul. We need to hold out that vision that we can have those successes. We need to celebrate those successes along the way, but we want to do it within the context of a very intentional framework. So again, we can expand and grow this movement. So remember that I started with a question that Rowan asked me driving home about a year ago in the Bay Area. And I think at the time, if I recall, I'd maybe had one conversation with a recruiter very early on about this opportunity. So I hadn't talked with the kids about this opportunity or about IDA or light pollution. Rowan's question was a pretty simple one. He said, "Dad, can we watch some old movies?" That's interesting. Yeah, sure, Rowan. Why do you want to watch some old movies? He said, "I'd like to see what the night sky looks like." So that was pretty profound for me. And I remember that as I started going through this process of discussing with the board whether I should relocate my family down to Tucson and take on this next crazy stage of my life. And I kept coming back to that question. And a couple months later, as it was getting more real, I asked him, "Rowan, do you remember that conversation we had about the night sky? Where did that question come from?" Well, his family, his grandparents live in southern Utah, in a small desert community, Kayenta, beautiful, out by the Red Rocks, no lights anywhere, absolutely gorgeous. You can see the Milky Way at night. It's part of a small town on the edge of St. George called Ivins, Utah. Some of you might recognize the name Ivins, Utah. In fact, is there anyone from Ivins, Utah here? We have a very active affiliated group in Ivins, Utah that's looking to become a dark sky community. Once I put the pieces together, it was clear that I had to take this opportunity. It was very clear that Rowan's question about wanting to see the night sky was inspired by the conversations he'd had in southern Utah with advocates like you. So thank you. I wanted to end with a short quote that I found inspiring, and just encourage you to take pleasure in the journey that we're going to be on over the next few days. Thank you.